something I took away between the panels this morning is the metaphorical use of death and theater and the make-believe. And like Michelle, actually, I have done 2 studies in the last several years speaking to aid coordinators and policymakers on the ground versus policymakers in the home capitals. And I've seen that same frustration and that disconnection that appears between the people who see what's really happening and then the decision makers back in the home capitals. Minus an occasional Canadian, they seem to be the tougher nuts to crack. And I'm going to say, Michelle, very sadly, even though I see these same experiences as you, when I interview people in the home capitals, I get the feeling that the dead body Ilan referred to is going to be dragged out again and again, even in spite of Trump and some new clothes put on, maybe even a red hat. I don't know what will be appropriate in this historical context. Even the shriveling body parts that Omar referred to, they'll be well looked after by the largesse of international donors. So I've worked a lot with Ella Tartier. We often critique this sort of model of Oslo. And what I decided to do for my part of the talk was to focus on one element, the Paris Protocol, and to just show how ludicrous it is to assume that this can work. This element of Oslo that is so key to Oslo working. If you can't have Paris working, you can't have Oslo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have slides that are actually disconnected yet completely related to what I'll be saying to you. I'm going to show slides of what conditions are like when you think of movement in Palestine and when you think of movement out of Palestine. And then I'm going to describe what the Paris Protocol is and some of the reasons it has failed. So the Paris Protocol is one of the sort of the successes you could see of the international community, if you can call it a success. But from their perspective, it was an early success in 1994, where the idea that was created that you have a Palestinian state, right, and you have an Israeli state, and you're going to need to have an economic arrangement between the two. So, based on free market principles, led by the World Bank, led by important international actors, they put in place a plan with seemingly contradictory goals. It was that you need to increase Palestinian economic independence in order for the Palestinian state to work. But you need to do it while simultaneously encouraging deeper economic integration with Israel. Now, I think it's very important to caveat here, too. Was there a Palestinian state by this point, 1994? Is there a Palestinian state now? We've been talking about, is there a Palestinian state? Will there be a Palestinian state? Actually, what was happening was the international donors were looking at Israel and Palestine and basically formalizing the one state, the occupation. Now, a lot of the logic behind this was that Israel had a superior economy and the Palestinians have a lot to learn from Israel. This is a key sort of thread behind the donor engagement. You have a Western liberal democracy dealing with an Arab other, a non-democracy, a non-Western country. So we need them to be like Israel, and we need them to be like the West in order for Oslo to be a success. Western economists working with the donors generally argued that Palestinian services and infrastructure improved under Israeli occupation, that industry developed, and the Palestinian territories from 1967 had thrived generally since being occupied. This was based on economic data that they had drawn, that found the GDP increased, basically, was the argument. So based on the benefits the Palestinians gained from the exposure to Israel and the belief in this economic cooperation for peace, the World Bank argued for greater economic openness between Israel and the PA in order for their economies to benefit from one another's strengths. The donors, Israel, and the emerging Palestinian leadership put this in place with the Paris Protocol, formalizing a union of Israel and the Palestinian territories into a single economic zone with a common currency. It also created an external border, an external Israeli border, where Israel collects import taxes on goods destined for the Palestinian territories, before then transferring those taxes at their own discretion to the Palestinian Authority. Under the protocol, Israel should transfer to the PA any value-added taxes on goods and services sold in Israel that are meant for Palestinian consumption. I think if you asked Ilan or you asked any of the historians of the occupation, of the colonization of Palestine, they'll note that this doesn't look too different than what had existed. This was still just one state, just with the accoutrements of a two-state theater. Israel is, for instance, given the right to unilaterally determine the tax rates imposed on goods and is allowed to take a significant administrative percentage from those funds. And it's always an unfair amount. The protocol also gave Israel significant leverage over the PA, as those taxes it collects comprise a very large percentage of the PA's monthly revenue, which Israel has on many occasions withheld when it felt it needed. Palestinian trade with other countries would continue to be handled through Israeli seaports and airports, or through border crossings controlled by Israel between the occupied Palestinian territories with Jordan and Egypt. Israel could continue to choose what gets in, who gets in, what goes out, and who goes out of the Palestinian territories. Now, that cooperation was never meant to be equal. It was always assumed to be asymmetrical, but I think a lot of the policymakers who developed this plan thought it would work. Many might not have. Now, in the background, I've been flipping through images which shows the reality of a movement in Palestine. And while Western policymakers envisioned a Palestinian economy that would rely on export-led growth, Israel ended up using control over Palestine's borders to undermine Palestinian trade. Israel has even used security reasons to deny frequency allocations to Palestinian telecommunications providers in order to give its own companies advantages over the Palestinians. Israel has regularly withheld Palestinian tax revenues as punitive measures against the PA. Al-Haq has done a good job of listing some of these. In August and September 1997, tax revenue was withheld after a bombing in Jerusalem. In December 2000 until December 2002, taxes were withheld during the Second Intifada. From March 2006 until July 2007, after Hamas's electoral victory, taxes were withheld. After the PA signed a reconciliation agreement with Hamas in May 2011, taxes were withheld. After Palestine attempted to upgrade its status at the UN and was accepted as a member of UNESCO, taxes were withheld in November 2011. After November 2012 and the overwhelming UN General Assembly vote to recognize the state of Palestine, taxes were withheld. In 2015, in January, Israel withheld critical tax revenues over Palestinian moves to join the International Criminal Court. In July of this year, a bill was passed in the Knesset to deduct the salaries of Palestinians accused of terrorism from roughly $130 million a month that's collected and transferred to the Palestinian Authority. In a bipartisan vote, 87 MKs supported the legislation, while 15 opposed. Now, of the quote I'll give you was, under the new law, which was sponsored by MKs Elazar Stern and Avi Dichter, money that would otherwise go to pay stipends to roughly 35,000 families of Palestinian terrorists and their families will automatically be frozen in accordance with the Paris Protocol, without the need for special approval from Cabinet. Now, I don't have time really to go into the description of this, but almost needless to say, the Palestinian economy has went into decline almost from the moment the Paris Protocol and the existing one-state formula was formalized. And there's a lot of data that shows basically a great recession hit the Palestinians in the mid-90s at the height of Oslo. There's no way that an economic arrangement can work with no freedom of movement and no rights. There's no way the Paris Protocol and the free market export-oriented plan can work without freedom of movement and rights. Oslo is predicated completely on that economic model working in order for democracy and peace to take hold. I'm sorry, there's supposed to be no audio origin in this. Because of this arrangement, the Palestinians became immediately dependent on aid. They went from a business-driven society to one dependent on aid, and it has not shifted since 1994. Essentially now, the $35-odd billion the international community has committed to the Palestinians has offset the costs of their occupation and colonization. And as a result of all this, the Palestinian economy has de-developed sharply. This is sadly pretty normal. Imagine if you saw this take place, any one of these images or instances in the UK or wherever you're from. This would be top news. It would be shocking. How could this happen? How can you get on with your daily life? Yet this is the normal life in colonized Palestine. So the open question is, can the Oslo framework work? Especially also when you have the third major actor, the international community, continuing to analyze the context not as what it is, but as that dead body they don't want to be dead, dressing it up over and over again in the name of peace. Thanks.